to regulate the assembly of these is itself irreducibly complex. In fact, what we have here is irreducible complexity all the way down.
We know a lot about the bacterial flagella. We still have a lot to learn, but we know a lot about it. And there's no explanation for how this complex molecular machine was ever produced by a Darwinian mechanism.
Darwin's theory is absolutely breaking down. The more we examine, the more we look, the deeper we peer into this complexity called life, the mystery of life, which used to be a black box, the more it opens up and shows to us that there is this fantastic, complex factory filled with machines, all working together, almost as if somebody planned it, almost as if somebody built it, almost as if somebody designed it. The evidence is coming in over and over again, and it is overwhelming. And the evidence is increasingly pointing to the reality of the Creator. Well, how are people responding to that? Dr. W. The speculations of the origin of species turned out to be wrong. It is ironic that the scientific facts throw Darwin out, but leave William Paley, a figure of fun to the scientific world for more than a century, still in the tournament with a chance of being the ultimate winner. Amazing, is it not? The heavens declare the glory of God. It pours forth speech day after day. It is there. Well, let's examine another piece of the statement by Carl Sagan. Remember, he said evolution is a fact that is amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. We just looked at biology. Let's take a look now at the fossil record. We will begin again with Darwin's own criteria for which we might reject his theory. He said the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the Earth must be truly enormous. And they should be, correct? If you have this long period of time, this very gradual changing species into other species, then what he's saying, that evidence should be everywhere. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? In other words, he says, why doesn't the fossil record show it? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graded organic change. So he's admitting that, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, I don't know how many times you have been told that the fossil record proves evolution. But what we have from Darwin is from the get-go, he says we've got a problem in the fossil record. So, we're going to ask Dr. Berlinski to give us a picture as to the problem associated with this idea of a long, gradual process and the number of changes which must have occurred in order for us to achieve the complexity that Darwin's theory says it should achieve.
The question has to be raised, as it should be raised whenever an evolutionary sequence is mentioned. What are exactly the predicted properties one would expect to find as one passes from a land-dwelling creature to a sea-dwelling creature? Specifically, how many changes are required to go from a creature such as Ambulocetus natans, which seemed to have been a land-dwelling creature, to a creature that spends the entire portion of its life in the ocean? Curiously enough, this is not a question that evolutionary biologists ask a whole lot. I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations myself, and the most modest estimate I could come up with is that an organism requires roughly 50,000 morphological changes to adapt itself to the open-going ocean. And as soon as we introduce a quantitative estimate, however loose, however flabby, however spontaneous, then a great deal of puzzlement starts to intrude into the otherwise sunny picture. 50,000 changes, and we've got 2 members of a sequence. Where are the other 49,999 members of that sequence if Darwinian changes are incremental and they're small? After all, we're not talking about changes that are arbitrary. A creature must have these changes if it's to survive in the open ocean. And any attempt to put a quantitative number should induce a profound sense of perplexity, because the number of changes is so much greater than anything we see in the transitional record. Now, what is the proper explanation for this? Please understand, I don't have it. But neither do the other guys. Neither do the other guys. And in my opinion, they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the question. That is a fundamental question in paleontology. How many changes are required? Can those changes be compared to the fossil record? And if they are compared to the fossil record, why do we see such deficiencies in the record as compared to the necessary changes? Very important issues.
Okay, so you understand the argument he's making here. If it only requires one change to go from a cat to a dog, then it would be easy for us to miss it in the fossil record. But if a change from one species to another requires 50,000 changes, there ought to be some evidence of that somewhere. Well, Darwin, recognizing the problem in the fossil record in his day, answers the problem this way. He says the geological record is extremely imperfect. In other words, he says we just haven't dug up enough fossils. And this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find intermediate varieties, connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Well, this leads us to an interesting situation then. If Darwin says you can reject my theory if the geological record doesn't show it, then let's examine the geological record. Patterson, who is an evolutionist himself, says, I will lay it on the line, there is not one such transitional fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. In other words, what he's saying is, look, when you look at the fossil record, you don't have that watertight argument there. You can't say that the fossil record shows this gradual change from one species to the other. I'm sure you've heard of the Archaeopteryx. When I first heard of it, it was conclusive evidence. It was the missing link. Is it? Or is it simply a fully formed species of its own? In other words, it's what Dr. Berlinski was saying. If you require 50,000 changes to get from here to here, and you have something that looks like it fits in there, and maybe you have 2, the question is that really supporting this theory, or are these 2 just simply unique species? An interesting question. David Rupp now says, the director of the Field Museum of Natural History says, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. So Darwin said, you can rightly reject my theory if the geological record doesn't show it. The reason it doesn't show it now is that we just don't have enough fossils. Well, now we're 120 years later, and we got a whole lot more fossils, and guess what? We're even worse off now than we were then. Now, Stephen Jay Gould recognized that those transitional forms are just not there. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and the nodes of the branches. The rest is inference. However reasonable, it is not the evidence of the fossils. So Dr. Gould responds, not with, there must be a creator, But he responds with his own theory. You may be familiar with it. It is called punctuated equilibrium. This is what it looks like. The gradual theory of Darwinism looks like this. This is time, and it explains over time the slow, gradual change in living organisms from the simple to the complex. Gould then says a species will go along in time in a stasis mode. It doesn't change. And then all of a sudden, there is a great immediate change in that species. Changing to another species. That then sustains a period of stasis until, boom, there is another immediate change. So we have the situation where Dr. Gould, recognizing that the fossil record does not support the theory, has now come up with another theory that is interesting because his theory is supported by the lack of evidence. You know what I'm saying? In other words, what he says is, my theory is supported by the lack of evidence in the fossil record. That's a strange place to be. So the fossil record does not support what Darwin proposed to be the truth claim about reality. Dr. Jonathan Wells, in his book Icons of Evolution, has gone through what he calls the icons that evolution has used over the years to explain why evolutionary theory is true. And yet when you look at these icons, we begin to find that they are hollow. They do not have the evidence to support them. So each one of these, whether we're talking about the fabled picture of man arising from apes, or Haeckel's diagrams I told you were faked, or the homology argument that says evolution's true because of the similarity, or the four-winged fruit fly that we've bombarded with radiation, or the peppered moths, you recall we now find have been tacked to the trees, to the tree of life that, as we just have seen, there is no evidence except for the end nodes. And finally, the picture that we've all seen, the convincing argument that, of course, we have descended from apes. What is the evidence? Well, what I'd like to do is to take a look at one of those icons. And that icon is the finch's beak, Darwin's finches. If you've been through a science class in America, you no doubt have heard the argument that Darwin's finches are the evidence that evolution is true. He wrote about it a lot. It's been captured in an incredible video called Icons of Evolution. And we're going to take a look at a clip on one of those icons referring to Darwin's finches.
The second icon of evolution, according to biologist Jonathan Wells, are finches found on the Galapagos Islands off of South America, islands Darwin visited in 1835 on the voyage of the HMS Beagle.
Another icon of evolution are some species of birds on the Galapagos Islands that are very similar except for the size and shape of their beaks. And it's thought, and it's quite possible, that they evolved from a common ancestor because of having to eat different foods on the different islands.
In 1994, journalist Jonathan Weiner published The Beak of the Finch, a book about research into the Galapagos finches. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Weiner argued that the finches represent the best and most detailed demonstration to date of the power of Darwin's process. Similar claims are made in many biology textbooks.
The Galapagos finches are a spectacular example of evolution. When the food quality, in other words, the kind of food that was available, changed as a result of a drought or a particularly rainy year or something like that, over the course of just a couple of years, they could see dramatic changes in the beak sizes of various populations. Natural selection can drive changes of structure, like the beak, in one direction in response to selective pressure, not just fast enough to account for what would be required for Darwin's theories, but actually 50 to 100 times faster than that.